He left her pregnant on the mountain, but the dog came back 5 times to save her. Caleb stopped the car in the middle of the gravel road, said they needed to talk somewhere quieter, and asked Elena to get out. She got out without suspicion, because in 7 months of pregnancy, he had never done anything to make her doubt him. Then the car peeled out. It took her cell phone with it, which was in the glove box, the bag with her documents, and the entire 7 months of promises he had made, while they built a dream together in a small mountain hollow, nestled in the Appalachian backcountry. That's when Shadow jumped through the open window. The dog landed badly, tumbled over the rocks, got up shaking the dust from his dark fur, and ran in the opposite direction of the car, heading straight back to where Eleanor was standing in the middle of the road. She was still staring at the bend where the vehicle had vanished, her arms hanging limp at her sides, her thin sandals planted on the uneven ground, which wasn't meant to be walked on like that. Shadow barked once toward the curve, then went to her, sniffed her sandals, raised his wet snout up to her big belly and stood still, as if he had made a decision. Eleanor lowered her eyes to the dog. He looked at her. She looked at the empty curve. And then, finally, the crying came all at once without warning, with a force that doubled her over, her hands on her belly, her knees giving way slowly until she was sitting on the rocky ground with her legs crossed and her face lifted to the blue sky that had no intention of caring about what was happening there. Shadow pressed his warm body against her arm and stayed quiet. In that moment, Eleanor didn't know much. She didn't know what had gone on behind the scenes of Caleb's decision. She didn't know that a document was being prepared for her to sign. She didn't know that her own history with that land had roots deeper than anyone had ever told her. But she knew one thing. She was alone in the middle of a mountain road, 7 months pregnant, her feet in thin sandals, with no money and no phone, and the only creature that had stayed with her was a big, dark-furred mutt with a torn ear who had jumped from a moving car so he wouldn't abandon her. That detail, small as it was, entered her in a place that despair hadn't yet reached. She ran her hand along the dog's back, felt the warmth of his fur under her fingers, and took a deep breath. She had to think. She had to try. Eleanor had arrived at that mountain hollow 2 years earlier, transferred to teach crafts at a community arts center, at a time when life in New York City had worn her down more than it had sustained her. She grew up in a simple family, the daughter of a woman who worked as a seamstress from home and a father who had disappeared before she learned to write her own name. She had learned early on not to depend on anyone, and that very lesson, with an irony that stung, had become her biggest blind spot. Because when Caleb showed up, a skilled carpenter with an easy smile and calloused hands who could fix anything that broke, she let her guard down for the first time in many years. And when he said he wanted to build a life with her on that stretch of the Appalachian, she believed him. They had taken out a debt with a local shopkeeper to renovate the house where they lived, an old structure that needed a new roof and reinforced walls. Nothing of high value, but in a small community where reputation was currency, a debt was always more than money. It was exposure, it was porch talk, it was ammunition in the wrong hands. And Mrs. Martha Vance, Caleb's mother, knew how to use ammunition better than anyone Eleanor had ever met. What Eleanor didn't know was that Martha had discovered the debt long before Caleb imagined. And that, days before the road, she had given her son an ultimatum with the coldness of someone who had rehearsed that moment. Either he split from Eleanor before the baby was born, or she would reveal the debt to the whole neighborhood, to the township board, to every person who shopped at Caleb's store. The small business he had built with so much effort would go down the drain. He gave in, and by giving in he made the worst choice of his life, on a rocky road, on a merciless sunny day. Eleanor knew none of this as she tried to stand for the first time. Her knees hurt, her sandals gave no support, and the uneven stones made each step a negotiation. The weight of her belly shifted her center of gravity, and she had to lean her torso back to keep from losing her balance. Shadow walked beside her, stopping when she stopped, watching every hesitation. After more than a mile, she estimated by sight, with no real certainty, her legs simply refused to go on. She sat down on a wide rock at the edge of the path and stared at the road that rose and fell through the Appalachian backcountry without revealing what lay around each bend. The sun was beginning to go down when Shadow grew restless. He sniffed the air for a few seconds, turned around in a circle, looked at Elena as if asking permission, and then vanished among the bushes on the hillside. She called for him once, then stopped, afraid to waste what little strength she had left. The silence that followed was too heavy. Only the wind in the rocks, the distant sound of some bird she didn't recognize, and the beat of her own heart in a rhythm that seemed wrong. 18 minutes later, Shadow returned. In his mouth he carried a piece of dry bread, hard as rubber, which he had found among the scraps left by drovers who occasionally passed along that road. It was a little. It was stale. It tasted of salt and dust mixed together, but Eleanor ate every crumb without wasting any, because the child growing inside her needed whatever came along. That was the first time. Shadow left again soon after. This time he was gone longer. When he came back, he carried in his snout a wet rag, dripping water which Elena recognized. It was the piece of old towel tied around the dog's neck on hot days. He had found a nearby creek, that cold water stream that ran down the slope, and which she herself had seen more than once during walks, but that alone she would never have found in her condition. She squeezed the rag into her mouth with both hands, drank what she could wring from the soaked fabric, and then pressed her forehead against the dog's warm snout and closed her eyes. The relief was small. The gratitude was enormous. That was the second time. Night came with a speed she wasn't prepared to face. The back country held a dampness that rose from the ground when the sun left, and with it came a cold that didn't match the hot day that had been. Eleanor had nothing but the light clothes she wore, a faded long-sleeved blouse and a wide dark skirt, dirty with dust and marked by the stones. She hunched her shoulders, wrapped both arms around her belly, and stayed still where she had stopped, because walking in the dark over those rocks would be more dangerous than staying put. Shadow lay down over her legs. He was big enough to cover most of her thighs, and the animal's body heat was real and steady. She ran her hand slowly over his fur, more to calm herself than to comfort him, because he didn't seem to need comfort. He just seemed determined to be where he was, as if there were no other option in the world that made sense to him at that moment. She slept in fits. She woke at the slightest noise, a branch breaking, an animal passing in the distance, the wind shifting direction. She always kept one hand on her belly. In the early morning, during one of the times she woke up with the cold hitting hardest, she felt the baby move with force. Once, twice, 3 times in a row, like someone knocking from the inside. She kept her hand still over the movement until it stopped. And then she lay there, staring at the stars that appeared between the mountains, in a number the city had never shown her. "You're doing okay in there," she said softly. "I'm going to get you out of here. You can trust me." With the first light of day, which came timidly over the mountaintops, in that orange-grey color that precedes the sun, Shadow got up. He stretched slowly, shook his fur, and then looked at Elena, with that dog's gaze that carries an almost human attention. He began tugging at the hem of her skirt, leading her toward a smaller trail she hadn't noticed the night before, a narrow, packed dirt path, almost invisible from where she stood, that gently sloped down the side of the ridge, parallel to the main road. She hesitated. The unknown path could lead anywhere, or nowhere. Shadow tugged again. She got up with difficulty, pressing both hands on her knees to steady herself, standing with an effort that left a dull ache in her back. And then she followed him. Every stone was a negotiation. Her sandals had broken on one strap, and she took them off, tucking them in her hand, preferring the bare ground to the instability. The trail took nearly 40 minutes of slow walking. When it opened up onto a flatter area on the other side of a wire fence, there was a small house with a dark red clay roof, a clothesline full of colorful garments, a herb bed, and chickens wandering freely in the yard. An old woman with completely white hair, wearing a floral apron over her everyday clothes, was squatting, picking something from the garden when the dog barked. She stood up slowly, with that characteristic difficulty of someone who has carried more than 7 decades in their body, and stood still, staring at the figure appearing on the other side of the fence. A young woman with long dark hair, completely disheveled and partly tucked behind her ears, her face marked by dried earth and old tears, holding the broken sandals in her hand, her feet bare and red, her large belly thrust forward by the advanced pregnancy. She was standing, but seemed about to collapse at any moment, and the dog was beside her, sitting with the posture of an animal that knows what it's done and waits for confirmation that it was enough. The old woman dropped what she had in her hand and came running. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, take the chance to hit like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now, continuing, Mrs. Abigail had been a widow for 16 years, after 42 years alongside a man who worked the land with the patience of someone who knows that the harvest can't be rushed. They hadn't had children. It was an old ache she had learned to carry in a way that no longer weighed more than it could, turning the space a child would have occupied into dedication to the neighborhood, to the chickens, to the garden, and to a quiet faith that everything in life had a purpose, even when the purpose took time to show up. She was a small woman with narrow shoulders and strong hands, her face full of lines that weren't from suffering but from expression, from laughing so much, from worrying so much, from paying so much attention to the world around her. She didn't ask any questions when she brought Elena inside. She heated water on the wood-burning stove that sat in the corner of the kitchen, brought a wool blanket that smelled of cedar and good weather, laid the young woman down on the thick fabric sofa in the living room, and went to get food. While she reheated a batch of collard green broth she had made the day before, she kept glancing sideways at the visitor's belly, making silent calculations with the experience of someone who had seen a lot happen in that small mountain hollow over the decades. When Elena had eaten and drunk, and warmth began returning to her extremities, Mrs. Abigail sat down in the chair across from her and stayed quiet, waiting. She didn't ask. She just remained present, with the particular patience of someone who knows that certain stories need to be told, at the pace of the person who lived them, not at the pace of the listener's curiosity. Elena looked at that woman for a long moment. Then she started talking. She told what she could tell without falling apart entirely. That she had come to the hollow 2 years before, that she had met Caleb, and it had been a natural thing, unhurried, like things that don't need a push. That they had built things together, made plans, that the baby had been welcomed with joy, at least on her part. That there had been signs she ignored. His more and more frequent absences, Mrs. Martha Vance's growing coldness every time they met, the sideways glances that stopped whenever she got close. That she had convinced herself it was paranoia, because in life she had learned that abandonment was something that happened to other people, not to her. Mrs. Abigail listened to everything. When Elena finished, she stayed silent for a few seconds and then said, "How long did you walk?" "I don't know. A long time. With this big baby. With this big baby." The older woman got up, went to the landline phone on the kitchen wall, an old corded device she kept as if it were the center of the world, and called the neighbor on the other side of the ridge. Clara had been a midwife for nearly 30 years before she stopped practicing, not by choice, but because her knees had decided that kneeling on a birthing floor was an activity for someone who still had enough cartilage left. Small, with short grey hair and hands that were large and strong, completely mismatched with her tiny frame, she had the reputation of never having lost a baby in 3 decades of work, and of never having done a favor for anyone who didn't deserve it. When Mrs. Abigail called, she just said, "I'm on my way," and hung up without another detail. She arrived in 40 minutes, walking the usual path on foot, with a worn leather bag slung over her shoulder. She examined Elena with the slow, careful attention of someone who knows what she's looking for, and isn't in a hurry to pretend she knows more than she sees. She measured the belly with her hands, listened with her ear pressed close, palpated with a firmness that was professional, not rough. When she finished, she stood by the sofa in silence for a while, looking at the ceiling as if she were arranging difficult words into an order that would cause the least possible damage. "The baby is big," she finally said, "bigger than it should be for this week. You're at risk of premature labor if you go through physical or emotional stress in the coming weeks. And you've been through a lot of physical and emotional stress in the last 24 hours. Elena closed her eyes. "What do I need to do?" "Stay lying down. Eat real food 3 times a day, with whatever good stuff you have. Drink water, Don't run, don't carry weight, don't get yourself worked up more than necessary. If you do this for 2 weeks, this baby will likely wait for the right time. And if I don't?" Clara looked at her with a frankness that wasn't cruel, just honest. "Then it becomes a touchier situation, and up here in the backcountry, we don't have the setup for a touchy situation." Eleanor nodded slowly, her brow furrowed, processing. Then she said something that made Clara and Mrs. Abigail exchange a quick glance. "Please, don't tell anyone I'm here. Not yet. Don't call anyone from the Hollow." "Why?" asked Clara, not with judgment, but with the precision of someone who needs to understand in order to help correctly. "Because he'll find out where I am, and I need time to think before I decide what to do about it." Clara looked at her for a moment, then she turned to Mrs. Abigail and said, "She stays here as long as she needs to." Mrs. Abigail answered without even blinking, "I had already decided that when she came through the fence." What they didn't know was that the process of discovery had already begun, about 1.5 miles from there, in a pasture where a 17-year-old boy named Justin Vance was herding the family's goats early in the afternoon. Justin was Caleb's nephew on his mother's side, a quiet young man who preferred animals to conversation and who had known Shadow since the dog was a pup. You couldn't help but know that particular mutt, with his large build, his coat between grey and brown, and his right ear torn since his first few months after a fight with a young beaver that had ended in a draw. When the dog appeared at the edge of the pasture that afternoon, sniffing the air and apparently headed somewhere for some purpose only he understood, Justin stopped the herd and just watched. "Shadow," he called. The dog looked at him, wagged his tail twice in recognition, and then disappeared back over the slope without stopping. Justin was quiet for a moment, thinking about what it meant. Shadow was alone. Shadow never walked alone through those hillsides. Shadow was the kind of dog that wouldn't stray more than 50 yards from Eleanor or Caleb without visible anxiety. Seeing him there, free and on his own mission, with that determined stride of someone who knows where he's going, was something that didn't fit with anything normal. When he got home at the end of the day, he told his mother what he'd seen. The news traveled through the family network the way news travels in small mountain hollows, not in a hurry to reach the most logical destination, but with surgical precision to find the most dangerous one first. Before it reached Caleb, it reached Mrs. Martha Vance. She received the information, stood in the living room with her arms crossed and said nothing for a few seconds. Then she told her sister-in-law, who had brought the news, that she didn't need to tell Caleb yet, that she would check on it herself. Martha Vance was a 58-year-old woman who had raised 2 children on her own after her husband left when she was still young, a story she had rewritten so many times in her own mind that she no longer knew which version was real. The result of that rewriting was a woman who had turned pain into control and control into identity. She knew what every person in the community owed to whom. She knew which family had a health problem they preferred to hide. She knew who had done what in which year. And she kept that information not out of pure malice, but because information was power, and power was the only thing that had ever given her a sense of safety in the world. Caleb, her youngest son, had been the recipient of all the protection she hadn't been able to give herself. And Elena, who had come from outside with the confidence of someone who owed nobody any explanations and the independent manner of someone who didn't need approval, had represented from the start a threat that Martha couldn't clearly name, but felt in her chest like something solid. 2 days after the news about Shadow reached her, Martha showed up at Mrs. Abigail's door. She knocked with the smile of someone making a courtesy visit, introduced herself as an old acquaintance passing through who had heard about a young woman in need of help, and was welcomed by the older woman with the natural hospitality of someone who lives in a place where a visitor is always welcome. He sat in the living room, accepted the coffee that was offered, talked about the weather and the overdue rains, and looked around with calculated discretion. Clara was at home when Martha arrived. The midwife had known that woman since the county harvest fairs and communal prayer circles. She knew her smile, the way she entered any space with the posture of someone who knows she'll stay, the habit of wrapping questions in concern. And there was something in the way Martha looked through the bedroom doorway where Elena was lying, just a fraction of a second, too quick to be noticed by anyone not paying attention, that set off a signal inside her. The midwife stayed close. An hour later, with Mrs. Abigail busy in the kitchen, Martha sat down in the chair next to the sofa where Eleanor was resting. The young woman opened her eyes as she felt the presence and recognized that woman in an instant. The recognition hit like cold water on her face, startling everything awake at once. "Elena," said Martha in a sugary voice that didn't match her demeanor, "I'm so glad you're okay." Elena didn't answer. She just waited. "You know Caleb regrets it, that it was all too rushed. The family wants to help." "The family," Elena repeated softly. "We all want you and the baby to be well. And with that in mind, I talked to people who understand these things, and I prepared a document that will formalize the support the family intends to give during this time, to give you security, to make everything clear." Martha took from her purse a sheet of paper folded into thirds. The paper was plain, without letterhead, written by hand in handwriting that Elena recognized as not being Caleb's. She reached out to take it. That's when Clara entered the room with a tray. "Excuse me," said the midwife, with a calm that was armor. "Let me see that first." Martha reacted with a motion to pull the paper back, but Clara had already taken it, with those hands that were stronger than her body size suggested. She unfolded the sheet. She read it aloud, slowly, without haste or drama, as if reading a grocery list. It was an agreement drafted in deliberately confusing language, with long sentences that folded in on themselves, in which Elena renounced any future claims on shared assets from her time with Caleb, agreed to a parental responsibility arrangement that between the lines put her at a disadvantage regarding the child not yet born, and acknowledged that any financial support from the family was a voluntary concession that could be withdrawn at the donor's discretion. At the end, there was a space for a signature and 2 fields for witnesses. Clara folded the paper back, handed it to Martha. Then she looked at the woman with an expression that wasn't anger. It was something colder than anger, firmer than any shout. "You have 5 minutes to leave this house," she said. Martha remained still for a second. Then she tried to articulate some explanation, but Clara had already positioned herself between her and Elena in a way that made any further conversation impossible. Mrs. Abigail appeared at the living room doorway with the look of someone who had been listening from the kitchen and had decided what she understood of the situation. Martha left. But before leaving, she stopped on the doorstep and said, in a tone that had lost all its sweetness, "This isn't over." And then she went off into the afternoon, back toward the road, heading to the hollow. Eleanor stared at the ceiling after they heard the gate close. Her belly throbbed with the tension of the moment, and she placed her hand on it like an automatic gesture of protection. "What's she going to do now?" she asked in a low voice. "What she always does," replied Clara, sitting in the chair beside her. "She'll use what she's got. The question is, what do you have?" Eleanor stayed quiet. She thought. Then she said, "I've got nothing. No documents here, no connections, no roots in this hollow. I'm an outsider." "Everyone here came from somewhere," said Mrs. Abigail, who had slipped into the room without a sound. "You're here now, that's already roots." The next day, Caleb showed up with his older brother. Thomas Vance was 42, taller than Caleb, broader in the shoulders, with a slow, deliberate way of speaking that had earned him a reputation over the years as a man who didn't talk, just to hear himself talk. He was respected in the small mountain hollow, not because he was the richest or the oldest, but because when he said he'd do something, he did it. And when he said he didn't agree with something, there was a reason worth hearing. He'd been the one to mediate more than one land dispute between neighbors, the one who'd helped organize the collective work after the flood 4 years back had destroyed part of the houses on the north slope. Thomas was the first to speak, standing outside the fence, with Caleb a step behind and slightly off to the side, like someone who'd chosen the role of observer over protagonist. "Good morning, Mrs. Abigail," Thomas said, with the respect of a man who'd known the old woman for decades. "I came with my brother to sort things out." "Sort things out," Mrs. Abigail repeated, in a tone that wasn't hostile but wasn't welcoming either. Elena needs proper care. We have room at our house with the support she'd need through the end of the pregnancy. It would be best for her and the child. Inside the room, Elena had heard the voices and was already sitting up on the sofa. Clara put a hand on her shoulder with a gentle pressure that said, "Don't get up yet," but Elena was already on her feet before the hand settled. She walked to the living room, opened the door, stood in the doorway, looking at the two men outside the fence. Caleb glanced at her, then looked away. Thomas looked her straight in the eye, and she stared back. "I'm not going anywhere with your family," she said. Her voice didn't waver. "The child I'm carrying spent a whole night on a gravel road because his father didn't have the guts to disobey his own mother. That tells me everything I need to know about the kind of support this family has to offer." There was a silence. Thomas looked at her for a time that was long enough to be uncomfortable. There was something in that scene, the steadiness of that woman with her belly out front, her bare feet on the cold floor, the direct gaze with no visible weakness, that hit him in a place where the logic of sorting things out couldn't reach. Caleb said nothing. He turned on his heels and walked back toward the road. Thomas stayed a second longer, looking at Elena with an expression she couldn't fully read, and then said, "Excuse me, Mrs. Abigail," and he left, following his brother. Shadow, who had been lying in the sunroom and had stayed absolutely still throughout the whole scene, perked up his ears when the two men walked away. Then he lowered his head and went back to resting. That afternoon, while Eleanor was asleep and Mrs. Abigail was cooking on the wood-burning stove, Clara went out to the backyard and sat on the wooden bench under the old mango tree at the far end. She had a lot on her mind. She knew Martha Vance wouldn't give up. She'd known that woman long enough to know that a refusal wasn't the end. It was the start of a more elaborate strategy. And she knew that Elena, without documented roots in the community, was at a real disadvantage if things turned into a formal confrontation. But there was also something Clara had stored in the back of her mind since the afternoon Shadow had shown up in the yard with a metal button in his mouth. It was a small round button of brass darkened by time, with an indentation in the center that she had recognized immediately as being one of the buttons she herself had sewn onto an old jacket donated many years ago to the youngest son of Mr. Arthur, the solitary farmer who lived farther up in the Appalachian backcountry, on a property he had inherited from his father, and who rarely came down to the small mountain hollow except for the weekend markets. Mr. Arthur was a man of few words and many papers. His father had been a notary back in a time when being a notary was a job that mixed faith with bureaucracy, and who kept much more than deeds. He kept stories, genealogies, verbal agreements formalized at the request of those who had no access to a larger system. Mr. Arthur had inherited from his father a wooden box full of documents that he had never known exactly what to do with, but had kept with the same care one keeps something one doesn't understand, but that seems important. Clara had visited that box once over 20 years ago, when she needed to check an old birth record for a family inheritance matter. She remembered the box, the smell of old paper and controlled dampness, and a notary far too organized for the size of the place where he had worked. The next morning, she went to visit Mr. Arthur. Meanwhile, Thomas Vance had spent the night awake. He had returned home after the visit to Mrs. Abigail with something inside his chest that didn't go away with dinner, nor with the small talk his wife tried to keep up during the meal, nor with the silence of the bedroom after she fell asleep. It was something he couldn't name exactly, but it had the texture of second-hand shame. That shame you feel not for what you did, but for what you let happen. Caleb was his younger brother. 18 years separated the two, and throughout his life Thomas had played this confusing role between brother and father figure, trying to balance affection with authority that had never really been his to wield. He knew Caleb had a complicated relationship with their mother. Everyone knew, nobody spoke about it. And he had learned early on that the easiest way to deal with Martha Vance was to agree until the situation was small enough to be ignored. What he had seen in that backyard, however, wasn't getting smaller. The next morning, Thomas went to Clara's house. The midwife received him without surprise, as if she had been expecting him. She made coffee, served it in silence, and sat on the opposite side of the table waiting for him to speak. "I want to know what really happened," he said. Clara told him everything. She told him about Elena's condition when she arrived, the bloody feet, the malnutrition, the risk of premature labor. She told him about the document Martha Vance had tried to get the young woman to sign. She opened her bag and took out a folded piece of paper. She had kept it after folding it and handing it back to Martha Vance. But later she had asked Elena to write down everything she remembered, and the young woman had reproduced it point by point with an accurate memory that was surprising. Thomas read slowly. He reread a passage. He folded the paper, placed it back on the table, and stared at his coffee cup. "My mother prepared this," he said. It wasn't a question. It wasn't in her handwriting, but everything points to it being her idea. Thomas stared at the coffee for a long time. Then he said, "I didn't know." "I'm not here to accuse anyone," said Clara. "I'm here because you asked, and because that girl is alone in the back country with a baby almost due. No documents, no roots in this hollow, and the people who should be taking care of her are working against her." Thomas left Clara's house an hour later with a different weight than the one he had carried in. It was no longer the weight of a situation that needed to be sorted out. It was the weight of an injustice that had lingered in the shadows for far too long, and one he had helped keep there without realizing it. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, feel free to leave a like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us folks just starting out a lot. Now, moving on. In the days that followed, Elena slowly regained her strength, like someone building a wall brick by brick without looking at the whole thing, focusing only on the next piece. Mrs. Abigail cooked 3 times a day and whipped up soups with whatever was in the garden. Collard green broth with carrots, savory sweet hominy grits with squash, beans with fresh herbs she picked before the sun got hot. Clara came every morning to check on the baby, sometimes staying until midday, chatting with Elena about things that weren't the tough situation, about the lace-making method Elena had learned before she moved, about the birds the midwife could identify by their songs, about the history of the mountain hollow that Mrs. Abigail told in bits and pieces over the days, like someone who has time and knows time is a gift. Shadow kept up his routine of coming and going. He vanished over the ridge during the hottest hours of the day, and came back with unexpected things that Elena had started mentally cataloguing as if they were chapters in a story the dog was telling in his own way. A ripe fruit that had fallen from a wild jabuticaba tree on the southern slope, a braided piece of straw some farmer had left on the path, which Mrs. Abigail turned into a pot holder. Once a note folded inside a plastic bag that had fallen from some hiker's backpack lost on the trail, and when opened, it revealed only someone's shopping list. Flour, salt, candle, battery, soap, sugar. The list was from nobody important, but it made Elena laugh. The laugh came out small, almost shy, like someone trying to remember how it's done, but it came out, and the sound of it in that little room smelling of herbs and old wood was like a window opening in a place that had been shut for a long time. Mrs. Abigail, who was folding clothes in the corner, stopped and looked at her. She didn't say anything. She just smiled back with that specific smile of someone who's happy for another's joy without needing to share in it. That afternoon, while Eleanor rested with Shadow lying at her feet, the midwife sat outside with Mrs. Abigail and told her about her visit to Mr. Arthur. The farmer had received Clara with surprise but not hostility. He was a man of nearly 70, alone on the property since his wife had gone to live with their daughter in New York City, used to visitors who arrived with old questions only he could answer. When she explained what she needed, he got the wooden box without hesitation, like someone who had been waiting a long time for someone to come asking about those things. The box was full of yellow documents, some typed on machines whose letters were no longer made, others handwritten with the formal handwriting of someone who had studied at a priest's school. The stamp from a notary office that no longer existed appeared on several of them, faded but readable. Mr. Arthur knew them one by one because he had spent many years organizing them with the care of someone who inherited something they don't understand but respect. It was in a bundle at the bottom of the box that Clara found what she was looking for. A land ownership record, typed dated over 50 years ago. It described a modest strip of land at the foot of the eastern slope. Exactly the slope where Elena had been abandoned on the road, exactly the area she had come down with Shadow before reaching Mrs. Abigail's house. The record showed the family name Clara had associated with Elena after a conversation the previous week, when the young woman had mentioned in passing that her mother was born in these Appalachian backcountry parts into a family of farm workers who vanished before she was born. The surname on the document was Miller. Elena's mother's full name was Sarah Miller, a name the young woman had mentioned without paying it any special attention, like someone citing a biographical fact without imagining it could be relevant. Clara had stood looking at that paper for a long time, on her feet in Mr. Arthur's house, her hands holding the document as if it might disappear. When she finished telling Mrs. Abigail, the two of them were silent for a moment. "Do you think she knows?" asked Mrs. Abigail. "I don't think so. I think her mother never told her. These stories get lost like that. People think they won't amount to anything, so they keep them to themselves. And then there's no one left who knows there was something to tell." "Are you going to show her?" "I am, but not today. She needs a few more days of strength before she takes on another big thing." 2 days later, when Elena was sitting in the sunroom catching the morning sun with Shadow beside her and her belly soaking up the warmth, Clara sat down in the chair across from her, placed the envelope on her knee, and said, "I have something to show you, and I need you to listen calmly because it's good news, but good news can be heavy too sometimes." Elena looked at the envelope, then at Clara. "Go ahead." Clara told it slowly. The visit to Mr. Arthur, the box of documents, the research, the surname. And then she opened the envelope and placed the old paper in Elena's hands. She read it again. Raised her eyes to the hillside visible from the sunroom, that same hillside she had come down with Shadow, those pale rocks and dry bushes she had seen from the inside, with the eyes of someone who is surviving, not someone who is coming home. "This land belongs to my family," she said, not as a question, but as someone testing the words to see if they hold weight. "The record is from your maternal grandfather. The land was never transferred, never contested, never sold. It's there, quiet, waiting." Eleanor kept staring at the paper for a time. Clara didn't interrupt. Then she ran her hand over her belly in a slow motion, like someone passing along information. "We have a place to stay," she said, more to the baby than to anyone else. The news about the land reached Martha Vance in less than 2 days. In a small mountain hollow, certain things travel through the air, not because anyone speaks deliberately, but because the lack of walls divides everything between those inside and those outside. And Mr. Arthur had mentioned Clara's visit to the owner of the grocery store where he bought supplies, who had mentioned it to his wife, who had commented to her sister-in-law. Martha Vance found out through one of those silent chains that never have an identifiable culprit. When she found out, her demeanor changed so abruptly that even Caleb noticed. The woman who had built an entire strategy around a debt and an ultimatum suddenly started talking about how what's best for the child is for the father and mother to be together, and how the family could help sort out the land documentation, because these things are complicated and it's easy for someone to lose their rights if they don't know how to handle it. The shift in speech was so visible that Caleb stared at his mother during dinner with an expression that mixed confusion with something from further back, something he had tried not to look at for a long time. "You want to help sort out her land because you want to help her," he said slowly, "or because you want access to what's hers?" Martha Vance turned her head to him with the speed of someone who hadn't expected the question. "What kind of question is that?" "It's a direct question. Caleb, I'm your mother. I want what's best for you and your son. You told me to leave her on a road," he said, in a voice that was starting to sound different from all the other times, lower, firmer. "I gave you advice that you chose to follow. You gave me an ultimatum." Martha Vance stood up from the table. The conversation had drifted from where she'd planned, and she wasn't in the habit of staying in open ground when she didn't control the terrain. "I'm tired," she said. "Let's continue this tomorrow." Caleb stared at his plate. He didn't say another word, but something inside him had shifted that night in a way that wouldn't go back to its place. 2 days later, Martha Vance went to Mrs. Abigail's house with a woman who introduced herself as a community mediator, someone who had informally played that role in a few neighborhood matters over the years and had a long-standing connection to Martha Vance's family. The woman spoke smoothly, like someone used to getting things done, and said she'd come to help facilitate an agreement that would work for everyone. She said the child's father had the right to be present from the birth, that if Elena blocked access, the local township board could be brought in because the community had a long-standing tradition of mediating these situations before they turned into bigger conflicts. Elena was sitting with the baby in her arms. The boy had been born 3 days earlier, with a strong cry that had woken Shadow from his spot on the sun porch and Mrs. Abigail from her sleep in the early hours. She listened to everything the mediator said with that kind of attention someone gives when they're processing every word before letting it in. When the woman finished, Elena said, "I never said the father won't meet his son. I said I'm the one who decides when and how." "With all due respect," the mediator said, "the decision isn't unilateral when a child is involved." "With all due respect," Elena replied, just as calm, "the child is 3 days old and survived the pregnancy because a dog went to fetch water from a creek, while his father didn't have the guts to disobey his own mother. So for now, yes, the decision is mine." Martha Vance, standing silently beside the mediator, pressed her lips together. Mrs. Abigail slowly got up from her chair and said she'd get water for the guests, but the way she said it made it clear the matter was closed. The mediator took the hint, because an experienced mediator knows when a situation won't give way that day. When the two women left, Eleanor stared at the baby. The boy had his eyes closed and his tiny fist resting against his face, completely unaware of what had happened in the room 2 minutes ago. She put her finger in his hand, and he closed his little fingers automatically. That reflex babies have before they even know they have hands. "No one's going to make any decisions for us," she said to him. That same afternoon, Thomas Vance went to Martha Vance's house and asked that Caleb also be there. It was unusual. Thomas rarely requested a formal meeting at his mother's house. He usually showed up without notice, with the ease of someone who knows he's welcome. The formality of the request signaled something. Martha Vance received her 2 sons in the living room with coffee already served, as if she were prepared for any conversation, which was her way of trying to control the terrain from the start. Thomas placed the folded paper, the copy of the document Clara had kept, on the table, opened so everyone could see. "You prepared this," he said, looking at his mother. Martha Vance looked at the paper. Then she looked at Thomas, then at Caleb, then at... "That was done in the interest of the family. For a pregnant woman to sign without understanding what she was signing," Thomas interrupted, in a voice that didn't need to rise to fill the entire room. "In whose interest, Mother?" "I'm protecting what we have. We don't have anything worth what she went through," Thomas said. "And I didn't know you had done that. Now I do, and now you need to know what I think about it." Martha opened her mouth to answer, but her older son continued, "You raised us alone. I know what it cost you. I saw it. But you mixed up protecting with controlling, and that confusion made you send your son to leave the mother of your grandchild on a gravel road, 7 months pregnant, without a cell phone, without money, in the dark." He paused. "That boy spent the first night of the pregnancy on the road because you were afraid of a woman who never did anything to you." The room fell very quiet. Martha stood still for a while. Caleb stared at the table. "I didn't know it would turn out like this," Martha said finally, in a voice that had lost all its defensive armor. "I thought he would call, that she would get someone on the phone." "You knew her cell phone was in the glove compartment," Caleb said suddenly without looking up. "You saw me take it before I left." The silence that followed was different from the others. Martha stared at her younger son. Caleb looked back at her, for the first time that night, for the first time in many weeks, without looking away. "I made a mistake," Martha said, barely audible. No one answered. Because at that moment, no answer was enough or necessary. What had been said had come out, and now it hung in the air of the living room, solid and unshakable, as everything that has been acknowledged can no longer be pretended out of existence. Dear listener, If you're enjoying the story, go ahead and hit like, and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now moving on. In the days after that night, Martha's house grew very quiet. The woman who had filled every space with the intensity of control suddenly seemed to take up less room, as if she had shrunk a size on the inside. She didn't talk about Elena, didn't talk about her grandchild, didn't talk about the land. She cooked, washed, tended to the chickens she kept out back, and every now and then would stand still in the middle of some task with a distant look that Caleb had learned over the years to recognize as her look when she was thinking about things she couldn't say. Caleb, for his part, spent those days doing something he had avoided his whole life. He got quiet with himself. He didn't go visit Elena. He didn't send a message. He didn't ask his brother to mediate. He stayed in the carpentry shop, which had a way of receiving whatever life threw into him. The physical work, the smell of wood, the rhythm of sandpaper over the surface, and he thought with the slowness of someone who had finally stopped running from what he needed to face. There was one specific thing that kept coming back. When he had stopped the car on that road, he had looked at Elena in the rearview mirror while she was still standing there, before he turned the curve. She hadn't run after the car, hadn't screamed, hadn't gestured. She had stood still, arms at her sides, and her belly between her and the world, watching the vehicle pull away with the expression of someone cataloguing an important piece of information. And next to her, Shadow had barked once at the car and sat down beside her. Caleb had thought about that scene every night since. The dog had jumped out of a moving car so as not to leave her. He had gotten out of the car voluntarily to leave her. That comparison lived inside him like a wound that he knew could only be treated by going back for what he had abandoned. On an afternoon with timid son, 2 weeks after the talk with his mother, Caleb went alone to Mrs. Abigail's house. He brought nothing in his hands. He hadn't prepared a speech. He stood outside the fence looking at the sunroom, where Eleanor was sitting with the baby asleep in her lap. She had her back to him at first, but when the dog pricked up its ears, she turned around. Shadow sat with his eyes fixed on the man. He didn't bark. He didn't move. He just watched with that animal attention that evaluates without reaching a conclusion. "Can I come closer?" Caleb asked, stopping at the fence. Elena looked at him for a moment, then she nodded. He entered slowly, closed the gate carefully, and walked up to the sunroom. He stood beside her, looking at the baby for a few seconds without speaking. The boy had dark hair like his mother, a round, relaxed face as if he didn't yet know the world could be hard. "He's—" Caleb began, but the word wouldn't come. "Yes," said Elena. There was a silence that wasn't hostile. It was the kind of silence that exists between people who have a lot to say and are still figuring out which thing comes first. "I was wrong," Caleb finally said, staring at the stone floor of the sunroom. "Not in a way I can explain that makes sense, because when I try to explain it sounds like I'm making excuses, and that's not it. It's that I was scared, an old fear that she knows how to use. And I let that fear make me do something He paused. "That I never should have done." Eleanor stayed quiet, listening. "I saw you in the rearview mirror," he went on. "You stood still. You didn't run. You didn't scream. And Shadow jumped." "Shadow always knew what to do," she said. The dog, who had remained motionless throughout the conversation, slowly got up at that moment, walked over to Caleb, and rested his muzzle on the man's knee. He stayed like that, quiet, like a judgment or an absolution, depending on how you read the gesture. Caleb didn't move. He slowly lowered his hand and placed it on the dog's ears. Eleanor watched that. There was a part of her that had learned long ago that animals don't lie about people, that their fear is always true and their trust is always earned. Shadow had slept across her legs on a cold road. He had gone to fetch what she needed 5 times, and now he had his muzzle on Caleb's knee, as if he were saying something he understood, but had no words for. But the decision was hers. "I heard you," said Elena, "and I understand what you're trying to say. But hearing is not the same as trusting again. And trust isn't something you recover in an afternoon." "I know," he said. "If you want to be part of your son's life, you're going to have to prove it with actions over time. Not with words, Not with constant presence, not with grand gestures. With consistency. With the ability to say no to your mother when she asks for something wrong without me being there to back you up. Caleb listened without interrupting. "So come back when you've done that," she said. "I'm not sending you away forever. I'm telling you the way back has a fair price, and that price is this." Caleb nodded slowly. He looked at his son for another moment. Then he stood up, took his hand off Shadow's ears and said, "Do I know the name you picked for him?" "I haven't picked one yet," said Elena. "I'm waiting to see who he is before I decide." Caleb made a gesture with his head that could have been agreement or respect or both, and left through the gate with the same measured pace he had arrived with. Shadow stared at the gate for a few seconds after it closed. Then he went back to the sunroom and lay down at Elena's feet. In the months that followed, things changed at the pace of things that truly change, slowly, without announcement, without an exact moment you can point to and say, "That's where it turned." 2 days after the conversation with Elena, Caleb had gone to Thomas. He had asked for help to start building on her land, not as a favor, as work. Thomas had agreed without asking unnecessary questions, because there were things that didn't need more words at that moment. He called 2 trusted acquaintances, and early one Saturday morning, the 4 men showed up on the Miller land with tools and materials that Caleb had bought with what he had saved over time. Elena had been watching from the window of Mrs. Abigail's house when they arrived. The baby was in her arms, sleeping with that specific calmness of a newborn who still knows nothing. She had stayed quiet for a few minutes, just watching the 4 men as they began measuring the land with ropes and stakes. Then she had called Mrs. Abigail. "Look," she had said simply. The older woman had come, looked out the window and stayed quiet too. Then she had placed her hand on Elena's shoulder in a light way, without a speech, and gone back to the kitchen to make coffee. The walls went up slowly, brick by brick, on weekends and Wednesday afternoons, the days when Caleb had no commissioned work. Thomas brought the materials in his old truck and sometimes ended up helping more than he had planned, because he discovered there was something therapeutic about work that produced visible results, unlike human mediations that rarely had a concrete wall to show at the end. Mrs. Abigail had ended up living with Elena and the baby. The decision hadn't been made formally. It had happened organically, as the best decisions do, through an accumulation of days when it made more sense to stay than to go. The older woman's house still stood on the other side of the ridge, with the chickens that a neighbor had started looking after, and the garden she visited every morning before the sun got too hot. But the afternoons were spent in the new house, which didn't have a complete roof yet, but already had a smooth cement floor and walls that stopped the wind. Between the 2 women, there was an age gap of nearly 40 years, but there was also a harmony that didn't need to be explained, because it was the kind of thing that happens between people who have been through something difficult and learned that the presence of a trusted person is a resource that has no price or substitute. Mrs. Abigail knew how to cook and understood the land. Elena knew how to create things with her hands and wasn't afraid of hard work. The baby was the center of gravity that kept daily life organized, the feedings, the baths, the sleep that needed to be protected, the first smiles that arrived one day and left the 2 women looking at each other with that expression of having seen something rare and precious. Clara had become a regular presence, no longer as a midwife, but as someone who belonged to that small circle that had formed around that house under construction. She had started receiving other women from the region who had heard about Elena's situation, not as gossip, but as a story that began to circulate with the strength of stories people recognize as true, and who sought out the midwife to talk about their own matters, things they had no place to put. Clara hadn't planned this, but there was something about the location of Elena's house on the hillside, between the road that led down to the mountain hollow and the ridge that rose to Mr. Arthur's pasture, that had made it a natural meeting place for those who needed a space that wouldn't judge. Mr. Arthur came down one Saturday morning with the envelope of documents in his hand and handed it to Elena personally, saying he had gotten a certified copy from a notary in the nearest town, and that the originals had been registered at a courthouse with a date and protocol number, that the land was hers according to the deed, and that any attempt to contest it would run into documentation more solid than many people expected. Elena held that envelope with an attention that went beyond what was written. It was her grandfather's hands, the one she had never known. It was the mother who had grown up in this back country without knowing she had anything here. It was the chain of choices that had brought her to that hollow, that had put her in a car with Caleb on that specific day, that had made Shadow jump through the window, all of it converging into a paper envelope that said, "You belong here." The first roof was finished on a Sunday morning. Thomas was at the top of the frame when the last shingle was fitted, and he shouted down in a way that wasn't solemn at all. It was the straightforward yell of a man who'd worked all day and was satisfied with the result. Caleb was on the ground floor and looked up with a smile that Elena, standing in the sunroom with the baby, could see from there. It was the first genuine smile she had seen on his face in a time she could no longer pinpoint with any precision. She didn't smile back right away. She just watched, assessed. Shadow was beside her, his attention split between the movement on the roof and the baby sleeping in her arms. The mutt had developed a specific bond with the child since birth, not protective in an aggressive sense, but watchful in a complete way, as if he had decided to include one more being on the list of those who couldn't be abandoned. Martha Vance appeared for the first time on a Saturday afternoon, 3 weeks after the walls were finished. She hadn't announced herself. She had simply shown up at the gate, in a dark dress, carrying a cloth-covered bowl with both hands. Mrs. Abigail was in the yard, and received her without hostility and without excessive warmth, with the polite neutrality of someone who knows that time is the best judge for certain situations. "I brought some creamy rice pudding," Martha said, "for whoever might want some." Mrs. Abigail took the bowl inside without saying much. Martha stayed outside for a moment, looking at the new walls, at the windows that still had no glass but had frames, at the clothesline that had been set up in the corner with white sheets the wind was stirring. Then she left. The following week she brought a folded piece of good fabric, "To make the baby some clothes if you'd like." The week after that she brought sweet hominy grits. Elena learned about each visit through Mrs. Abigail, who informed her with objectivity and without interpretation. She didn't say Elena should receive Martha in person, nor that she should keep avoiding her. She let Elena reach her own conclusions in her own time. One afternoon, when Caleb had stayed longer than usual, helping to install the window in Elena's room, and the baby was awake and lively on the blanket, spread out in the sunroom, Martha arrived alone. Caleb saw her coming and stood still for a second, the screwdriver in his hand. "Mom," he said. "I came to see the boy," she said simply. "If that's all right." Caleb looked at Elena, who was in the sunroom. Elena had seen Martha coming. She stood still for a moment, looking at the woman who had stopped at the gate with a posture different from all the other times, smaller, somehow, as if part of what had kept her upright had been removed. "You can come in," Elena said. Martha entered. She reached the sunroom with careful steps, like someone trying not to make noise. She stopped in front of the blanket where the baby was lying, looking at the sky with the specific concentration of a baby just a few weeks old, who is still discovering there's a world beyond the dark and the warmth. The woman stared at the child for a long time, and no one interrupted. The baby looked at her, those still unfocused eyes, gradually fixing on the new face that had appeared above him. And then, with that automatic mechanism babies have before they learn to be cautious, the boy broke into a wide, gummy smile at that unfamiliar face that had appeared in his field of vision like something new and interesting. Martha Vance grew very still. Then she lowered herself slowly, with the difficulty of someone whose knees are tired, and crouched down beside the blanket. She ran a finger over the baby's tiny hand, with a gentleness unlike any gentleness Elena had ever seen in her. The child closed his little fingers around his grandmother's finger, that automatic reflex that makes no distinction between who deserves it and who doesn't, and Martha Vance stayed like that, bent over and quiet for a few seconds. There were no words of apology. There was no speech. There was something in her silence that was more honest than anything she could have said. Because words Martha Vance had used in many ways throughout her life, to convince, to threaten, to manipulate, to protect, using methods that were the opposite of protection. But that silence was different. It was the silence of someone looking at the result of her choices with open eyes, with no way to rewrite what lay before her. Elena watched all of this without speaking. There was something inside her that had expected to feel anger in that moment, and the anger was there, real and legitimate. But there was also something beyond the anger that she was learning to recognize, something that had the texture of an old weariness that no longer wanted to be carried with so much weight. She didn't say it was okay, it wasn't. She didn't say she had forgiven, it wasn't that simple. But she stayed there, in the sunroom, with the afternoon sun and the wind from the ridge, and her son on the blanket, and his grandmother bent over beside him, and she didn't leave. That was enough for that day. The months passed with the quiet consistency of things being built. The house got a complete roof, the windows got glass panes. The garden that Mrs. Abigail had started in a makeshift bed grew along the side of the property and began producing enough for daily needs. The baby gained weight and presence, first smiles, then giggles, then a tendency to stand up, supported by whoever was holding him before it was time, with that determination of a child who hasn't yet learned there are limits. Caleb did what Elena had asked, not spectacularly, not with grand gestures, with consistency, with weekends of work, with Wednesday afternoons, with the ability to show up and stay quiet when there was nothing to do but be present. And once, just once, and Elena found out through Mrs. Abigail, who had heard from Clara, who had heard from a neighbor, he had told his mother in front of other people that what she had asked him to do was wrong, and that he wasn't going to let fear make that choice for him anymore. It wasn't a long speech, it was one sentence, but it was said in public without Elena nearby to see it, and that reached her as information, not as a performance. It was different. She had been quiet when she found out. She had stood looking out the window at the ridge for a long time. Then she had picked up the baby who was on the blanket and held him in her lap, sitting on the threshold of the new door. Shadow came over and lay down beside her, muzzle on the ground and eyes open, staring at the same ridge. "Do you think he'll keep this up?" she asked the dog. Shadow didn't answer, because he was a dog and didn't do that. But he stayed where he was, which was by her side, the only place he had chosen to be since the day he jumped through a moving car window. Elena thought of the 5 moments. The dry bread brought between his teeth, the wet cloth wrung out in stream water. The trail showed with the body, pulling at the hem of her skirt with the patience of someone certain of where they are going. Caleb's nephew recognizing the dog in the pasture, the chain of information that had followed, that had eventually put Thomas on the path to discovering the truth. And the snout resting on Caleb's knee that afternoon in the sunroom, that quiet gesture of an animal that takes its time assessing and makes no drama of its conclusions. 5 times, 5 paths found when she had no strength left to search. She had survived a night on a gravel road with 2 resources, a mutt and her own stubbornness. She had found a woman with white hair who had opened the door without asking, a midwife who had read a document aloud with the calm of someone who knows that a truth spoken clearly has power of its own, a farmer who kept in a wooden box a strip of land that belonged to her family without anyone else knowing, an older brother who had heard what he needed to hear and had the courage to do what the brother had not done. None of it had been easy. None of it had been simple. It had cost her things she could not yet measure precisely. Trust, security, a dream built one way that would need to be rebuilt another. But she was here. Her child was here. The house was here. The land was here. And Shadow was beside her, exactly where he had decided to be the day he jumped out of a moving car window, and where he had stayed in different ways through everything that had come since. The afternoon sun painted the rocks on the hillside orange, and the shadow of the Appalachian backcountry began to creep slowly down the east side. The baby, who had slept all afternoon, opened his eyes all at once with that quick waking manner he had developed, looked at his mother, and broke into a gummy smile that still didn't know what it was producing but hit the mark every time. Elena looked at him, at the backcountry, at the dog, at the house behind her, and she smiled back, completely, for the first time in a long while. End of story. Now, tell us what you thought of this story and where you are watching us from. Leave a comment with your opinion, give it a like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next stories coming up.